Okay. So welcome everybody to building and maintaining community relationships. I'm Kayla Zayas-Ruiz. I'm the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator. And I'm just gonna go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. So this meeting is being recorded. Participants won't be able to unmute themselves during the main session, but you will during the breakout sessions. We have enabled live transcription. So if you would like to see closed captioning, click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you would like to turn it off, that's also when you turn it off. Please excuse any errors that you may see as it is automated. And additionally, we want to acknowledge and thank our funding source, which is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, funded through the Library Services and Technology Act, administered through the Department of State for Florida, the Division of Library and Information Services. And so with all of that, if you have any questions during the session, please feel free to add those to the chat box, and our presenters today will address those. So without further ado, I will go ahead and let them take over.
All right, thanks, Kayla. Hello, welcome. Thanks for being here. Thank you to Kayla and to the SSDN for inviting us to talk with you today. My name is Emily Pfotenhauer, and I'm here today with my colleagues, Erin Hughes and Kristen Whiston, both from WiLS, and Ann Hanlon of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves in a moment. But first, I wanted to give just a little bit of context on what we do and why we're here. WiLS, Wisconsin Library Services, is an independent 501c3 member organization. We provide project management, consulting, and other services to all types of libraries across Wisconsin and beyond. And one of our big areas of work at WiLS is managing consortia and collaborations. And one of those is Recollection Wisconsin, which is our state's service hub for the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America. So a lot of parallels there to the Sunshine State Digital Network. And a lot of what we'll be learning, or what we'll be sharing today, is what it comes from what we've learned about developing community relationships through our work as we've grown the Recollection Wisconsin program over the past many years. One of our core governing partners at Recollection Wisconsin is the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and UWM, and especially Ann in particular, have been playing really important leadership roles in that program. Ann is our current chair for the Recollection Wisconsin Governing Board, and up until recently, she was also our hub's representative on the DPLA Network Council. So up on the screen, you've got a little overview of our time together this afternoon. After our introductions, we'll take a look at a recent white paper that came out of the Reciprocity in Researching Records Collaborative, which is a partnership between community archivists and scholars at the University of British Columbia and UCLA. And that article specifically has really informed our approach to this workshop. So we'll take a close look at that. Then you'll hear a couple of case studies, first from Erin on her work with tribal libraries, archives, and museums in the Midwest, and then from Kristen, and she'll share her experiences collaborating with small and rural historical societies in Wisconsin, and also her experiences working with LGBTQ+ archives. At about the 1 hour mark, we'll take a break. And then we'll send you out into breakout groups to discuss some of the principles for community relationship building and possible action steps that you might take at your institution. And then we'll bring us all back together at the end for a group discussion. And we'll wrap up just a little bit before 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Central. As Kayla said, you're welcome to post questions in chat as we go. And then we will have everyone's microphones enabled for both the breakout group and the final group discussion at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to the rest of the crew to introduce themselves, starting with Ann.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Emily. That was a great introduction to the day. I'm Ann Hanlon, and like Emily said, I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Libraries, and here my role is I'm head of digital collections and initiatives and our digital humanities lab. I've been here since 2012, and we thought that we'd talk about very, very quickly about what our, kind of community building experience or relationships. And I picked out a couple of the main things that I do, which relate to that. And because I head up digital collections, oftentimes I'm sort of, secondary or tertiary, but I pick up, I end up working a lot with the community members that our archivists and other librarians work with. And so we have a March on Milwaukee civil rights project, a digital project that we built in 2007 before I was here, but we rebuilt for its 50th anniversary, and it documented the civil rights marches for housing equality in Milwaukee in 1967. In 2018, I developed a project where we worked with 14 local artists who created work based on our digital and distinctive collections, and that ran at the Villa Terrace Museum here in Milwaukee through the summer of 2018. And so that was a great community building experience with a particular group of people. And most recently, I led our LGBTQ plus AV archive mining project, which worked with our existing archival collections, which have a great strength in LGBTQ areas in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, and really regionally. We hope to work more with the community, but the whole thing took place over the pandemic. And so we're hoping that is a collection that we can bring out to the community a little bit more now that things are loosening up. So that's me. And I'll pass it to the next person.
I need to unmute myself before I talk. Osio da Godo a Hia, Erin Hughes, Jidali Gay, Wolf Clan. Hello, my name is Erin Hughes. I am Cherokee Wolf Clan. I have been working at WiLS since 2017 as the Mukurtu Midwest Hub manager. I'm calling in from Madison, Wisconsin, which is on the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk Nation, a place we call Dejope. I recognize their forced removal and honor the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation. My position at WiLS supports the work of tribal libraries, archives, and museums to collect, preserve, and provide appropriate access to digital forms of cultural patrimony. I'm looking forward to sharing with you today some of the work that the Mukurtu Midwest Hub has done through the IMLS-funded Mukurtu Hubs and Spokes grant and the NEH-funded Curating Indigenous Digital Collections grant. I'll let Emily go next.
Thanks. So I have worked with WiLS. I'm also based in Madison, Wisconsin, and I've worked with WiLS since 2009 on the Recollection Wisconsin program, as well as other digital initiatives. And really, my priority for my work has always been supporting rural communities. I grew up in rural Southwest Wisconsin, just outside of town of about 2,500 people. And ever since then, that's really been a priority for me to serve rural, small and under-resourced communities. And I sort of got into that path through my graduate work. I have an MA in art history from UW-Madison. And after grad school, I sort of went sideways into the digital library world through a research project I led called the Wisconsin Decorative Arts Database. So I spent between 2006 and 2009 traveling around the state, visiting local historical societies, historic house museums, and other small community collections to document furniture, ceramics, textiles, and other decorative arts made in Wisconsin, and build a digital collection of those resources. I think we have Kristen up next.
Oh, I forgot my screen, or I wasn't muted. So great, good. I'm all unmuted. I'll to start with. So I'm Kristen Whiston, and I also am from Madison, Wisconsin. I've been working with WiLS and Recollection Wisconsin since October of 2020, when I was brought on to help launch the Digital Readiness Community of Practice, which we're going to talk about today. I also have worked with WiLS in our role as a convener of groups of people and organizations, like grantees of the ALA Libraries Transforming Communities grant, and help support those libraries around the Midwest, the upper Midwest, in holding some difficult conversations in their communities. I'm also helping Emily and our colleague Erin with the IMLS funded community memory cohort of the Accelerating Promising Practices program. So essentially, like Emily said, what we do is a lot of bringing folks together in ways that are beneficial to them. And then in my non-WiLS work, but also very applicable to our conversation today, I've worked pretty extensively with LGBTQ plus history. I co-authored a book called We Will Always Be Here, which is a primary source reader for teens on Wisconsin's LGBTQ plus history of activism, which drew heavily on Anne's archive and the Madison LGBTQ plus archive. So we're going to talk about that interesting intersection a little bit today of being a member of the LGBTQ plus community, working in archives, and researching the community. I think I'm going to hand this back off to Anne, right?
Yeah. So as Emily mentioned, our approach to this workshop really kind of emanates from this article or white paper, I guess, that recently came out called Come Correct or Don't Come at All, Building More Equitable Relationships Between Archival Studies Scholars and Community Archives. And I just dropped the URL into the chat for folks to check out. So I'm going to summarize some of the what they talk about in that article for everyone. And then fear not, we're going to have this slide up later when we go into breakout rooms, because we kind of want to use this as sort of a touchstone for how we talk about community relationships and how we go in and engage with the communities. So to start off with, the article itself really foregrounds a different kind of mindset when engaging with community-based projects, archives, and partners. Where this article and where the researchers are coming from describes these kinds of relationships as being much more about the community partner than about academic rewards or institutional benefit. And they're very concrete about what that means too, because I think it's one thing for us all to say that that's important, and it's another thing for us all to figure out ways to actually put that into action and to think about that. And one of the things that they talk about is that we need to have a shift in how we see what the rewards for engaging in these projects are. They're approaching this in this article in large part from the perspective of academic researchers, but so much of it also really does apply to us as archivists and librarians, digital archivists, et cetera. But ultimately, what our engagement with the community should be about is reciprocity. Shifting the emphasis from research outcomes to community benefits, examining our motivations, and even, and very importantly, really structural barriers that might exist for working with the community. So things like policies and even just basic administrative expectations, for example. And finally, I think one other important principle here, and then I'm going to go through some specific principles, is that this is the, overall, the approach that the authors take to building community engagement with institutional partners is that this is a much more long-term focused vision than a short-term rewards mindset. And actually, finally, one thing that occurred to me right before the workshop today is that we are fortunately also in a position to enact positive change in these kinds of community relationships, really thinking about what our institutions have been doing that are damaging and what our institutions can do that are reparative and helpful. So it's a good position to be in. I don't feel like that often. And so after thinking through that earlier, I thought, well, I'm going to add that. So the article outlines 9 principles for building mutually beneficial community relationships. And I'm going to quickly talk about those. And then they also talk about some protocols that go alongside those that are very much related. So the first is relational consent. And these are things that we're going to want to be talking about throughout and thinking about as we hear the case study. So relational consent means that when you're approaching the community, not in a transactional way. So rather, you're negotiating consent at many levels, being aware of and communicating with the community about how circumstances may change throughout the project that you're engaged in, making sure that they understand that they have a right to opt out. So if you begin with some kind of legalese, for example, that might not be the best way to go in to the community, first of all, but also that you continually check in, that people aren't, that their safety comes first. So mutual benefit is another principle that is emphasized in this article. And the idea is that you're not participating in extractive research, right? So none of us want to be transactional. None of us want to be extractive. So research should create real benefits for the communities that they serve or represent. We want to also recognize the expertise and authority of the community, as well as be willing to share our expertise and the benefits that come from that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about the protocols. Long-term investment. So again, this is not a short-term mindset, right? Not for immediate rewards. Sustained investment is the opposite of parachuting in. So again, we don't want to be transactional. We don't want to be extractive, and we don't want to parachute in. Those are the negative sides. But the positive side is doing things that support the community archives organizational goals. For example, what can you do to support their fundraising? What can you volunteer? In addition, to engaging in research or working with them to build an archives. Humility is one that might occur to everybody right off the bat. But humility is of knowing that if you could do this on your own, you wouldn't have to be coming to the communities to do this work. So they are enabling the work. And you also need to acknowledge where they are the experts, that they are the experts in their communities, and acknowledge that authentically. Accountability, ensuring that consent, again, this kind of relates to relational consent, but ensuring that consent is fully understood and continuously negotiated, bringing real resources back to the community, and being responsible not only to your institution, which we're all fully aware of how we need to be responsible to our institution, but being responsible as well to the community. There are a little bit in the article, if you have a chance to go back to check it out, they also talk a little bit about the difficulty of coming up with those mechanisms for accountability, but that's something that we can all begin working on where we have an opportunity for positive change. Transparency means that when you go into the community, you're really honest about why you're there, how long you're staying, and what you're getting out of working with them. So why are you doing this research? Just put it on the table. What are your barriers? What can you not negotiate? So that they know what you can do and what you can't do. And you're not making promises that you can't fulfill. And if they can't accommodate you, then that's okay. It's better to find that out at that stage. Equity means acknowledging and dealing with the power imbalance between an academic institution and a community or a community archive. Be willing to shift those dynamics where you can. That goes back to humility and respecting the expertise of the community, as well as transparency and being honest about what you can shift and what you are not capable at this point of shifting. Reparation means paying the community members for their participation. And that's meant quite literally, like if people are putting in the time and labor, find a way to pay them. And finally, amplification. And I like the way they put this in the article, so it's worth checking out. I think the way they described it was don't dub over the community, amplify it. So let your questions be changed by what you learn in the community. Don't go in with research questions or ideas about how to build a community archive or what it should look like, and not let the community respond to that and let their voices shine. So, and then there are protocols that accompany that. Being transparent, respecting community authority, expertise, and timelines, transforming consent into an ongoing relational process, prioritizing community safety, checking in and reporting back regularly and formally. So letting them know what you're learning and what they're learning from you. So, so that they really are part of the process. Giving published research and primary resources back to the community is another important protocol. Giving explicit credit to the community, providing options for co-authorship, but also considering whether it's to their benefit or not to be called out. So again, that goes back also to negotiating consent. Acknowledging their labor through compensation, bringing resources back to the community that your expertise enables you to bring back, such as helping them with grant applications, for example, advocating for funding criteria that might inadvertently or explicitly exclude community archives from applying. So that's something that we can do as well. Get involved with the work of the community archives. So again, don't just be transactional, but look at ways that you can actually volunteer, do things that might not benefit your research at the community archive, but makes, helps you to really give back to the community. And finally, take care of your own space first. And that means examine our own policies and procedures, advocate for adoption of new procedures if the ones that we have in place are damaging or are barriers. And Burgess Jules, who is one of the authors of the article, also suggests doing an equity analysis. And we won't talk about that today. It's worth checking out the article to see what he means by that, but it provides a good way of looking at the power imbalances that exist. So that is the summary. I hope I didn't go over time, but I wanted to make sure, because we'll be using this. We'll really focus more on those 9 principles as we go forward. So with that, I think I am now turning it over to Erin, right?
Thanks, Anne. So before I fully dive into telling you a little bit more about our Mukurtu Midwest Hub and the work in engaging community-based projects and relationships, I just wanted to give a very brief background of our funding and project development. So I'll dive into more specifics of all of this as we go on. So Kristen, next slide, please. The Mukurtu Midwest Hub was founded in 2017 with the grant project Mukurtu Hubs and Spokes, a sustainable platform for community digital archiving. WiLS, in partnership with Washington State University and the iSchool that's based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, established the Mukurtu Midwest Hub, which is a regional hub that provides support and training in Mukurtu and digital project support to tribal and non-tribal cultural heritage institutions. There are a total of 6 hubs that are located throughout the United States, and there is also an international hub that is in Australia. In 2021, with the support of the National Endowment for Humanities, WiLS began partnering with the Wisconsin Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums on curating Indigenous digital collections, which is a 3-year grant project that aims to advance the creation and preservation of Wisconsin Native Nation collections. The grant work is supporting knowledge preservation and language revitalization. Building mutually beneficial community relationships is at the center of all the work that we do. Next slide, please. So I'm sure some of you have heard of Mukurtu before and some of you have not. So I will tell you just a little bit about it. It's a free open source content management system that's designed to support the unique needs of Indigenous libraries, archives, and museums. Mukurtu's cultural protocol-based and community-driven platform empowers communities to create their own digital systems of cultural preservation and access in relevant and ethically minded ways. So the CMS is developed and maintained out of Washington State University Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation, which is also known as the CDSC. And it grew out of the research work of Dr. Kim Kristen, who's a professor and director of the Digital Technology and Culture Program, as well as the director of the CDSC. So her research work took place in the early 2000s with the Warramunga community in Australia. The work that is done by the CDSC, as well as all the hubs, to develop and disseminate Mukurtu really extends beyond the CMS and technology platform altogether. It's also a way of thinking about Indigenous information circulation and a process of building relationships that are based on trust and respect, and keeping Indigenous communities and those people at the center of all of the work. Next slide, please. So Mukurtu's development has been funded largely by a series of federal grants from IMLS and NEH over the past decade. One of Washington State University's Mukurtu initiatives was an IMLS National Leadership Grant, which is called Mukurtu Hubs and Spokes. In 2017, the Midwest Hub was formed in Wisconsin and became a regional support and training center for local tribal archives, libraries, and museums. These institutions are known as the spokes. Mukurtu started as a grassroots project to manage, circulate, and narrate the Warramunga Aboriginal community's digital materials using their own protocols. So the hubs and spokes aim to support this grassroots effort by really decentralizing the development and having hubs and spokes work together with the Washington State University Mukurtu team to expand the Mukurtu support structure, enhance features, design, and functions that were driven by local community needs. So our hub has focused on helping tribal communities with their digital initiatives, training, and implementation of the Mukurtu content management system. In addition to this, we've also been involved with the iSchool students in the Tribal Libraries, Archives, and Museums course, which is also known as the TLAM class, with service learning opportunities around Mukurtu and digital projects. So the TLAM class is a graduate level course which offers an introduction in Indigenous information issues and emphasizes Indigenous knowledge and holistic experiential learning. The course is designed as a participatory learning experience with classroom discussions, guest speakers, semester-long service learning projects. Students travel to the Indigenous communities and have personal contact with tribal cultural workers. Upon completion of the course, the students are able to articulate best practices for developing mutually beneficial partnerships with Indigenous communities and appreciate the role of culture and the importance of cultural competency in the library and information studies professions. Students enter the workforce with the skills and knowledge to implement these important practices within their institutions. Students also seek to help accomplish community-centered projects, providing necessary person power to push tribal community projects forward. So one of our partners for the Hubs and Spokes grant was the Ho-Chunk Language Division, and each semester the Hub helps support students traveling to the language division to work with the staff to arrange, digitize, and describe Ho-Chunk language learning materials. Students worked with tribal elders who provided translation and background information on digitized audiovisual recordings, assisted in drafting deeds of gifts, donor guides, and other digital collections policies, and created descriptive metadata for digitized items. Kristen, who's here with us today, was one of those TLAM students who worked on this. So it's through conversation and listening sessions with the language division that the Midwest Hub heard the need for continued support, a continued support person to really keep the project momentum moving forward between the spring TLAM classes. So the Hub funded a past TLAM student to continue their work with the language division. This student assisted with the project for another year, building their digital collections in Mukurtu instance. The strong, mutually beneficial partnership was celebrated by the language division and helped us develop and continue the work through the NEH-funded Curating Indigenous Digital Collections project. Next slide, please. So there are 12 sovereign Native nations that exist within the borders of the state of Wisconsin, and they all have a unique history and support programs that are charged with collecting, preserving, and sharing language and culture. These libraries, archives, and museums, historic preservation departments, and language revitalization programs not only preserve the belongings, stories, words, and spaces of their communities, they also protect tribal identity, knowledge, and sovereignty. So in 2021, with the support of the National Endowment for Humanities grant, WiLS began partnering with many of the Wisconsin Tribal Archives, libraries, and museums on curating Indigenous digital collections, which is a 3-year grant project that aims to advance the creation and preservation of Wisconsin Native Nation collections. Each year of the 3-year grant, a postgraduate fellow is collaborating closely with different Native Nation communities to help with a community-defined project focused around digital preservation and curation and Indigenous information issues. The fellowship role fills the need for more staffing to support the project goals of tribal communities. It also gives the fellow a safe and supportive space to foster meaningful, holistic learning and ongoing authentic connections among our tribal partners. Our first-year tribal partner for the Curating Indigenous Digital Collections grant has been the Ho-Chunk Nation Department of Heritage Preservation. We've specifically been working with 2 divisions. So we've continued work with the language division and also started working with the Museum and Cultural Center. Our participants in the grant have been equal partners in decision-making processes around project timelines, recruiting and hiring the fellows, and other program activities. Partners are fairly compensated for their time, labor, and expertise. And we honor the tribe's inherent rights to govern their own data and respect their decisions to limit access to content in accordance with their cultural protocols. We acknowledge our responsibility to maintain those trusted partnerships and that have been forged over the past years and find sustainable paths for these relationships to grow and flourish. Next slide, please. At the heart of our work with the Curating Indigenous Digital Collections project is a commitment to embracing the 4 R's of Indigenous education: respecting Indigenous cultural integrity, providing education that is relevant to Indigenous perspectives and experiences, fostering reciprocal relationships, and demonstrating responsibility through participation. Mukurtu enacts the 4 R's in a digital library environment designed to share information relevant to Indigenous communities in ways that respect Indigenous rights to self-determination in description and access, and facilitates reciprocal relationships between traditional collecting institutions and Indigenous communities through collaborative curation. By using the collaborative curation model, a model that values building knowledge and the people providing the knowledge, the fellowship positions have allowed each fellow to work with their designated tribal community to create policies, procedures, principles, and plans for their Mukurtu sites or other policy procedural documents that are needed for each community. Many of these documentations have been created by following the protocols for Native American archival materials. The fellow this last year has also worked with the Language Division and Cultural Center staff to build site structure and access protocols that identified key materials and metadata for the Mukurtu site. This site and content will be available to all Ho-Chunk tribal members at different access levels. So COVID has definitely created its challenges while working to continue to collaborate due to collaborative curation. When tribal communities shut down and staff weren't being paid for their work, we waited, as did the rest of the nation, to see how we could best support each community, because all of us at WiLS who are working on these projects have a deep love for our community partners. Our greatest desire was that they stayed healthy and that we strive to support them wherever possible. As time went on, tribal community offices did reopen and we began conducting virtual meetings. The collaborative curation model benefits greatly from in-person meetings and community building opportunities. We definitely noticed that it was much harder to foster these meaningful relationships virtually, but we have adapted to these necessary changes. And we're just now beginning to conduct in-person visits once again. Our second-year partner for the Curating Indigenous Digital Collections grant is the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians Cultural Affairs Department. This year's fellow, who was hired just a few weeks ago, will work on several projects, which include developing story maps of institutions with collections, documents, audio, and video pertaining to the Stockbridge-Munsee, planning for a digital collections website using Mukurtu, and designing a collaborative curation plan that will connect the Stockbridge-Munsee with state and federal repositories holding collections important to their community. The fellow will be using a lot of the resources that are through the Sustainable Heritage Network to develop many of these things. So WiLS has also entered into an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with the Stockbridge-Munsee, formalizing our project goals and long-term partnership. Next slide, Kristen. So as we move forward with all of our project work, we continue to implement all that we have strived for since the founding of our hub. Kim Christian and Jane Anderson summarize our goals in building and maintaining our Indigenous community relationships in the article Towards Slow Archives. They write that our emphasis is on one mode of decolonizing processes that insist on a different temporal framework, the slow archives. Slowing down creates a necessary space for emphasizing how knowledge is produced, circulated, contextualized, and exchanged through a series of relationships. Slowing down is about focusing differently, listening carefully, and acting ethically. Wado, thank you. So I think, Kristen, you are next.
Thanks, Erin. I always love hearing about the Mukurtu projects that you're doing, so thanks for sharing. So next up, I am excited to share with you some of the community-centered work we've done with a different community, the Digital Readiness Community of Practice here in Wisconsin. So I will explain a little bit about what that is. So as Emily mentioned, here at Recollection Wisconsin, our work with content partners often leads us to small and local historical societies, local historical organizations that I'm sure you all have worked with as well. Organizations like those will often ask us as they're preparing to digitize materials so that they can put them online with Recollection Wisconsin. They will say things to us like, we have a box of postcards or photos, but we don't know how to digitize them, and we don't know what scanner to buy, and we don't know, how to even get started. And so Emily and other Recollection Wisconsin folks have been answering these types of questions for several years and helping small and local historical folks build a support network. So we spent a couple of the last years really formalizing that support network as a community of practice. And before I tell you about that, here's a couple of key concepts as we start to talk about this work. So digital readiness, we define digital readiness pretty broadly as having the knowledge, tools, resources, and infrastructure to provide online public access to archives and historical records. So in other words, digital readiness really means, are you ready to undertake digitization? And then a community of practice, as we probably all know, is a group of people who share a common concern, set of problems, or passion about a topic, and deepen their knowledge and expertise in this area by working together on an ongoing basis. So here in Wisconsin, the vision was for all of these digital projects practitioners, the volunteers from historical societies, the local history librarian, the community archivist with a passion but no experience or funding, and the university archivist alike, to have this statewide, informal but consistent support network to turn to for digital projects, advice, and support. So we undertook the project in a couple of different phases, all of which most importantly have been driven by the community of digital projects practitioners. First, Recollection Wisconsin, funded by the National Historic Records and Publications Commission, conducted a strategic planning process in 2019 to find out exactly who those digital projects practitioners were, what they needed, and what they were missing. And then in 2021, again, thanks to the NHPRC, we implemented what we'd learned from the digital readiness community of practice. We researched and wrote case studies on digital projects. We conducted digital readiness events. We listened to the community's needs for resources written in accessible, non-technical language, and conducted several rounds of gathering feedback and advice. So let me break down each one of those a little bit. Between July and December of 2019, Recollection Wisconsin undertook information gathering and planning activities, including a web-based survey, 5 community conversations, and 3 strategic planning sessions. And 127 individuals representing over 90 different Wisconsin local historical organizations responded to that survey. I'll tell you briefly about the results of the survey and the conversations, but most importantly for our topic here today is the fact that we undertook that survey and those conversations in the first place because it was our commitment and our intention to hear from the community of digital projects practitioners, what they needed. And I think Emily's going to drop in the chat a white paper on the results of these surveys if you are interested in more complete results. But here's a few quick things that we found. 75% of these organizations said that they were digitizing without guidelines or policies to inform their work. Almost half of our respondents said that they already had digital content, but were not providing online access to it. 41% of respondents said that they were already turning to their peer organizations or other local history organizations for support or assistance when they had a question or needed something about digitization or digital collection development work. So all of this data informed the next steps of the digital readiness community of practice. So then we took everything we'd learned into the implementation phase of the project in 2020 and 2021. So first we formed a launch committee of digital projects practitioners from around the state, and they had all levels of experience, all size organizations. This launch committee was our first stop for feedback and guidance. And we set monthly meetings with them, not only to seek their advice, but to find out if we were even asking the right questions of the digital readiness community of practice. And then we undertook a document called the Digital Readiness Levels, there's a link to that going into the chat. So Emily and others drafted this document called the Digital Readiness Levels. They're based on the NDSA levels of preservation, which you might be familiar, but the levels are intended to be very accessible, even if you've never seen the NDSA levels of preservation. They're an accessible, non-consecutive way of assessing and progressing through a set of guidelines. So in keeping with our commitment to the community of practice, this document was sent to 68 different colleagues with whom we'd worked over the years. Anne and Erin were among that cloud of experts. And we asked their detailed opinions on everything from the flow of information to the content to the terminology. 25 of our colleagues responded with fantastic suggestions and ideas. And one of the things that we heard pretty overwhelmingly is that the digital readiness levels are a very helpful map, but that some kind of guide to implementing those levels or the concepts that are contained in there would be very necessary. So we heard that loud and clear, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then we put together a set of digital readiness case studies with local history organizations in Wisconsin. And this is one way that we've responded to the community's request for real life practical advice from folks who have done digital projects or digital collections projects. Conducting those case study interviews also gives us the opportunity to make connections between organizations who might not have the bird's eye view that we have at Recollection Wisconsin. And then of course, we get to amplify their work by putting their projects in the spotlight. In the summer of 2021, we planned 4 digital readiness fairs. Those digital readiness fairs virtually introduced participants to each other and to several different topics in the summer of 2021. There were topics like, what are we going to do with those 2 boxes of VHS tapes in the closet? Or sharing digitization equipment among local historical organizations, or using Clio to share our digitized materials. Really practical entry-level topics for people who needed to access that information. So the fairs were free and open to the public. The sessions and logistics were all planned by our launch committee with input from their own professional and practitioner networks. And all in all, the fairs attracted 270 attendees from 120 different organizations. They were 4 to 4.5 hours long, which is a really long time to ask people to sit on Zoom. So we intentionally guided and left a lot of space for community connections between attendees and speakers and everybody to check in with each other. And then I would like to call this our magnum opus of this project. The Digital Readiness Toolkit is essentially an entry-level manual into digitization for beginners. It incorporates a lot of what we learned and heard from the digital readiness community of practice. Emily and I are days away from launching it. So the link that Emily is going to put in chat will have the updated digital readiness toolkit within a few days. Check back next week. The manual is intended to provide users with either a front to back manual or a reference resource to consult a subject as they wish. It is full of best practices, case studies, links, templates, and examples. It's all written in such a way that anyone embarking on a digitization project can understand it. And there are, and not just people with technical experience and expertise. So that was really intentional. We found that there are many, many resources available for an academic or technical perspective, but very few, almost no resources available for a volunteer who has never undertaken this type of work before. So in order to make this content as accessible as possible, we've repeatedly reviewed the language for reading level, aiming for an 8th grade reading level, which is the average reading level of the American public, because that's our audience, is the American public. We also spent a lot of time combing through the documentation with our reviewers for any terms, acronyms, or jargon that might be intimidating, overwhelming, or not intuitive. And that out of that effort, we built a large digital readiness glossary that is part of this toolkit. The toolkit and its resources were reviewed in various pieces by about 10 of our colleagues, although more people have seen it now and provided some responses. And then we also sent the toolkit out to 5 beta testers to work through the entire manual as they embarked on their own digitization projects, and asked them to essentially find the holes, the confusing language, or any unclear concepts. So the final product has been shaped not only by those 15 reviewers, but by the hundreds of people that we've talked to in the digital readiness fairs, the planning and implementation phases, and the formal and informal conversations over the years. I think I'm going to skip over this next part because I bet Anne's going to draw some of these connections for us later about the work to the principles that we're going to talk about a little bit later, because I want to get to another perspective on community relationships and researchers. So as I mentioned before, I have this unique opportunity to be a researcher in LGBTQ+ history, a community member as a woman married to a woman, and somebody who has worked in some archival processing and a fair amount of outreach with these archival materials. So one good example of this that I'm the closest to is the Madison LGBTQ+ archive. It's a community-funded, community-driven archive housed at, but not funded by, the University of Wisconsin-Madison University Archive. And this is a pretty common arrangement for between community archives and university archives. So in 2019, I worked in the archive as a student doing some research and outreach with the project. Throughout 2020, I conducted research in that same archive for the book project, which was published in June 2021. Excuse me. That research saw my turn as a researcher of the community, still as a community member, which inevitably forms a pretty personal impact on me that research has. My understanding of LGBTQ+ activist history has a very visceral impact on me, because I'm researching queer elders who have fought a fight so that I can live the life that I live today. And at the same time, I'm still an outside researcher who didn't actually live that history. Then after that book came out, my co-author and I became involved with a traveling exhibit based on that book, the PBS Wisconsin documentary that is covering Wisconsin's LGBTQ+ history. And we also do many book talks around the state and attend Pride festivals where we're talking with LGBTQ+ people and teens, especially, all the time. So a couple of examples I want to point out here of the principles and how they have fit into that work. And again, I'll keep this pretty brief. But the type of consent that Anne talked about, the relational consent that is super important. We've had some folks ask us for our advice and input in one particular situation, and then take those words and use them in a different context that we did not agree to. We've also had our lack of consent, our no, challenged later on, like, are you sure you really mean no? So that puts the burden on a community member to continually maintain those boundaries. The long-term investment here in this situation is super important to me. These queer elders that I get to have these conversations with, I feel a deep responsibility to them to steward their stories respectfully and properly. I am often having private side conversations with them and other queer people that, as much as I love my co-author, she's a fantastic straight ally. She's not invited to those conversations. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's because I want to make sure that we are stewarding this information properly. It's my joyful responsibility to share with these people, these historical figures, what we're doing with their stories. So the book, the exhibit, the documentary. Transparency, my co-author and I have been the subject of many interviews. We've been interviewed for many different things. And it's occasionally clear to me, though unstated, that there is a hidden agenda of some kind. Sometimes they want the token lesbian, that's me, to sign off on something that they're going to do, mostly without us. Or they want our names as authors, but not particularly our input and perspectives. So in situations like that, we don't begrudge people their end goals and what they need to do. We just wish we could come to an honest arrangement about what it is that needs to be done. And finally, reparations. So I'm a white, cisgender, middle-class, educated woman. So reparations are not typically anything that should or are part of my daily life. I'm about as privileged as they come, but I make a firm stance that we are paid for our time and expertise, specifically to set the precedent that members of marginalized communities have unique experiences for which they should be compensated. So if I charge for a book talk, our hope is that it becomes much easier for the next author to charge for a book talk. With that, I'm going to turn this back over to Anne and Emily.
Okay, thanks, Kristen and Erin. That was super. That was great. I think at this point, what we want to do, because we've done a lot of talking, and we really wanted to set the stage so that people would have things to think about and to ask questions. And so we've got about, it looks like, I think 7 minutes right before the break to have kind of a conversation about the principles that I laid out and how they relate to the projects that Kristen and Erin talked about. So I invite people, I think folks can unmute at this point or raise their hands or type into the chat any questions or comments that you have. And I'm also happy to fill in any holes to sort of help us get started too, because I know sometimes it can be intimidating whether we're in person or virtual. On the other hand, we might have people here who have been waiting, sitting on their hands, waiting to say something. So please feel free to jump in. And while we're waiting, I'll make an observation listening to, especially to Kristen's presentation on the LGBTQ plus archives. This idea of that the community itself is, and we've got a hand up, is responsible for or feels responsible for maintaining their own boundaries. That's something that doesn't come up explicitly in the article that we stated. And that it's I think it's an interesting and good point. It goes along with that kind of, relational consent concept, but falls back too on humility and understanding that you need to have some empathy with the community. Jamie, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I wanted to really, share my gratitude to all of the presenters today for fantastic presentations so far, and I'm looking forward to the afternoon workshop session. I just had a quick question. I think Kristen brought up a really fantastic point about positionality and our personal experiences in relation to the work that we're doing. And I'm wondering if there's ever been a circumstance where you've come across a project where perhaps you decided to not move forward because you may have thought there's a better group or individual to take on this work than perhaps yourself, or that perhaps that your organization or however we want to frame it may not have been the best fit for a particular project.
I think any of the four of us could answer this, and so I'm going to turn it over to Erin. You might have a few specifics there, but Anne or Emily too, if that's ever happened.
Yeah, well, a more recent thing that happened is that because WiLS has been so involved with the Tribal Libraries, Archives, and Museums class, we've kind of been the thread that's carried a lot of the projects through. You know, the students come in every spring and then they leave, and so they're having a consistent person supporting those projects and keeping those projects moving is really helpful, and keeps the burden from the communities that are already really busy having to kind of organize and reorganize these things every single spring. So we've been really involved with that since 2017, and in the last couple of years there's been some turnover in staffing within the people that can teach the course. And so we were kind of approached, do you have somebody who'd be great? And I was put forward as a possible teacher for the class, and it was one of those things that I felt really uncomfortable doing because I am not an expert on Wisconsin tribal communities. And so even though I work with them and I'm intimately involved with them, I felt like it was a better thing for someone who is a Wisconsin tribal citizen to be teaching the students about a lot of the culture of Wisconsin tribes. So that's an example of how important it is to have community members teaching and being involved with projects, because their culture, their community, they know the best things to talk about and share with people. And so I think that that's incredibly important. And we really expressed that that was who we advocated to be in a role working with these students and with the service learning projects, as somebody who is so intimately involved with the community.
Great, thanks, Erin. And it's a great question. I can't. I'm trying to think of a time when that has come up, in UWM. I can't think of a good example, so I'm just going to say that right up front. But it certainly is something that we've thought about, and that's on our minds. So not super helpful, but.
It is, and I realize it's a very difficult question.
It's a great question. It's a great question.
You're humoring me in this.
Other questions?
Hi, this is Elliot. And I also just want to thank all of you so much for sharing with us today. Erin, you mentioned, I think that you'd signed an MOU with the Muncie Stockbridge or Stockbridge Muncie band. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the process of having a kind of formal documentation like that, and if that's something you've done in other circumstances, or sort of what led to the creation of that in this case.
Yeah, and I think Emily could also chime in here with us as well, but this is actually the first MOU, MOA that we've entered in with the tribal communities and all the work that we've done. So it was really, a very unique situation for us to be involved in that now, and something that I think that we fully almost advocated for or would prefer to have done, just because it does really lay out the needs and the desires of the community. So, and that was just we entered into it with the request from the Stockbridge Muncie band, and so we with Monique Tyndall, who's their director of cultural affairs, worked on an MOU, MOA, drafted it, and then sent it to her for review, redrafted it, and then that went to their legislator and their tribal legal department, and so then they reviewed that, we redrafted it again, and then once it was agreed upon between WiLS and the Stockbridge Muncie, we both signed it, and then that formal agreement is in place. And so it's a long-term partnership. It goes beyond our community and our curating Indigenous digital collections project. So there's, you know, it really forges a great relationship for beyond just this 1 year that we're working with them right now. So it's really an exciting thing. Very much encourage people to do that.
Well, and I'll just add that, as you said, Erin, that, you know, it's above and beyond one particular project. It's an MOU, basically establishing a partnership. A lot of times, an MOU with a tribal nation is talked about as a government to government document. So WiLS is not a government agency. We're not a state agency, but a lot of times these kinds of MOUs happen in the context of a state university or a state agency. And it really is important to have that relationship at the level of government, of tribal government. It went through their, you know, tribal approval process. It's signed by the president of the nation, and it was brought to us. It was not a suggestion we had that, hey, we should maybe have an MOU. It was brought to us by the partner, which was also really important. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, any other question? I think we're right about at time for a break. Is that right?
Yeah,
so
I was going to introduce, so after we're going to take a short break, and then after we come back, we'll do a little bit of a breakout group opportunity for you all to discuss some more in smaller groups. So just to introduce that before we head into the break, and we're going to ask you again to think about the principles from the white paper we talked about earlier, and we'll put those up on the screen again too, so you have them. But as we go into the break, we'll ask you to take a little bit of time to think, do a little bit of self-reflection about principles on this list that you might feel like you're strong in, that you're already implementing or that you feel comfortable with, and also a principle that you either you personally or you at your institution would like to work on. And then we'll break you out into groups and ask you as a group to land on one principle from the list of 9 that you'd like to spend your time in the small group talking about. And we're going to ask you to identify some specific action steps that you can take to implement this principle in your work. And we know that folks are at different, you know, sort of levels of authority or levels of decision-making authority at your institution. So there may be, you know, concrete steps that you can take for this principle that are more self-reflection and thinking about why you want to pursue this. So if, for example, you choose the principle of transparency, the action step for you could be something like reflecting on, you know, sort of the real reasons you're doing this work, what brings you to this work. Or it could be something that's more institutionally driven, like making it a policy to always share grant budget documentation or develop your grant budgets in partnership with the community you're working with. But anyway, we know that these sort of concrete action steps are going to look very different for folks depending on sort of where you are in your institution and what your institution is. So let's see, should we do how about we say a 6-minute break? We'll come back at 10 after the hour, so 2:10. I think most of you are in Eastern time, so 3:10. Here up on the screen is again the principles. So we'll come back together in a few minutes and then send you off into small groups to talk through a specific principle that you all land on. All right, so we'll come back at 10 after the hour. All right, hi everybody. You're back. So let's see, Anne, do you want to hone in on anything in particular we're seeing in the
Well, you know,
Instagram board, or what would people like to?
I think it might make sense to have it, just since we have the two groups. I think before we had thought we'd go through each principal, because, you know, in case there were too many people to do that in 30 minutes. But since we have two groups, if room one wants to kind of talk about theirs, and then room two. Sound good? Okay. All right, who is in room one?
I think that was Elliot and I.
Yeah, do you want to talk about your, you know, how you went about this, your strengths and weaknesses, what you identified?
Yeah, so we kind of talked more about like challenges and trying to balance like partner needs with like capacity and transparency, and like, so we talked a lot about also how some of the challenges kind of cross over multiple principles. They like incorporate multiple principles, so you can't really focus on one without also addressing the other. So under mutual benefit, which was something that we talked about being something we needed to work on, is like trying to align institutional goals with each other, right? So trying to figure out how you can meet your partner's needs that align with their goals and your goals, but you kind of have to have goals in mind already. So how do you like reconcile those things? And you know, that's obviously you do that through conversation and things like that, but like I know at my institution, we generally wait for partners to approach us rather than us approaching them. So that it doesn't seem like exploitative, right? Like we're not seeking something from them. But we also are aware of organizations in our community that we would like to partner with, but don't know necessarily how to start that conversation. And then we also talked about humility and some challenges with, you know, receiving that knowledge and that, you know, community expertise, and trying to balance that with the capacity of our partners, and how sometimes they're not always available to answer questions that we have if we're working with their collections, and not necessarily have the documentation that would answer those questions, right? And like it all lives in someone's brain, and they're not always available to answer a question when you need the answer to the question to move along in your process. So trying to figure out how to balance those things. And then also we talked about equity, and being transparent about capacity and clear expectations, and how that's really important to equity, and trying to give up power when resource levels are different. And then also trying to balance that with best practices, and when to say, okay, we're like, in order to meet your needs and the desired outcome of this project, maybe we don't follow this best practice. So those are the things we talked about in our breakout room.
I'm glad you mentioned the best practices things. I think that's one of the areas where this article doesn't, because it's focused on researchers and not libraries and archives specifically, that doesn't come into play. But that's, I would say, if I think about, you know, sort of my experience with community relationships and community collaboration, that the need to hold on to best practices is one of the things that like I have to give up, like kind of on a regular basis. That like there's, yeah, I've sort of continued to have to like look again at my relationship with best practices, and it's like, why, not why is the best practice in place, but like, is there a good enough version of this that we can let go of the practice?
Yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily that the best practices are bad or that we shouldn't kind of think twice before we let go of them. But I think a good example was something we were talking about during the break, which is for a long time, open accessibility was sort of a core principle for digital libraries, and we were kind of talking about why it took so long for the SAA to adopt the Native American protocols for archival materials. And I think Erin was saying that one of the big things was this idea of well, everything should be open, that why would we collect these materials, or why would we, why would these be principles if that wasn't a bedrock principle to, and so that really was a cause for reexamination of that particular kind of, if not best practice, kind of like expectation maybe.
I really love the direction the conversation is going, and it made me think about another recent article I read by Michelle Caswell and J.G. Goddard about decolonial archival praxis, and really the kind of like radical change in praxis that this article calls for has had me thinking a lot recently, like how do we operationalize that? In what ways can we enact this type of radical change? And that is part of it. I think we've been doing a lot of things in order to improve our practice, our community practice, but I feel that perhaps there's more, and I just really would love to like brainstorm about different ways that we can do better by our community partners. But yes, we have long, I don't think struggle is the right word, but we've long felt at odds in various ways with best practices and working with different communities. And how do we have better practice, right? Better practice to fulfill the needs of our community partners. And I don't know, I'd love to hear more about what others think about that, and how much can we change our position as academic institutions or like larger cultural heritage organizations. Earlier, and pardon because I forgot who mentioned this, but I heard something that really, I really liked about kind of like dropping the academy first mindset that we have, or the research first mindset. And it's funny because I've received, that's like what I get the most pushback on. And trying to like say, okay, yes, well, this is what we've done. And I understand, I'm working with an organization and I have to, to fulfill the strategic priorities of that organization, but also we're doing this work. And how do we kind of like negotiate that, that relationship? And obviously we're pushed, not obviously, because that's probably not a good way of framing that, but, I am pushing for community first, but there's challenges in that. I think we all encounter it. So anyways, I really, really appreciate this conversation, kind of the directions it's going, so.
Yeah, thank you. I've encountered that too, and I think I back to the protocols in that article, the take care of your own space protocol, which I took, to mean thinking about a lot of our policies and procedures that we have in place, because I've seen it happen where a specific kind of the way that an agreement is. A template agreement is phrased, it really disarms the community member, without examining what that says and what it means to them. So rewriting that kind of legal agreement's not easy, but it's important. So that's, for me, that's like one of the most like clear-cut examples.
Yeah.
I know I've seen.
And I don't know if group 1 is finished. Before I start, sorry, I jumped right in.
It's a conversation.
Okay.
But yeah, group 1.
But I think, so Kelsey and I did hit upon this point too, and we focused really in one area, but I agree with Kayla 100% when she says there's a lot of overlap. And I think that's how we ended up on, I'm not going to remember what it's called. I wrote it down. I think it's number 3.
It was investment.
Investment, thank you.
Mhm.
Short-term memory issues are real. So talking about, as you were mentioning, Anne, like, you know, how we have to take a look at our policies and draft some of these agreements in ways that make the most sense for community partners. One of the points that we hit upon was that, you know, sustainability and stewardship can look very different from partner to partner and exactly what their needs are. And so we need to be attuned to that, and we need to make sure that, you know, when we are having these formalized agreements, that we're not kind of ignoring their needs in that context. But I'm going to give Kelsey some room to talk about some of the other things that we discussed.
Yeah, so we talked about how, you know, each community is going to have different needs and different desires in whatever work you're doing with that community. So making sure that you are adjusting it to what their needs are. And like Kayla and Emily talked about, you know, whatever best practices are happening in that situation, you know, it's necessary to change what is needed and change what work needs to be done for the community that you're working with, and making sure that you are putting in the time and effort to have the consistent relationship, because we talked about how investment kind of bridges over to mutual benefit, and how you do have to put the time and effort in for what is working for your institution and what is working for the community that you were working with, and how it's just very important to put in consistent work and effort to have the long-term investment, and do whatever is necessary to keep that investment working and going, to have, you know, a mutual benefit and a good relationship with whatever community you're working with.
I wonder, you know, as I'm listening to you, Kelsey, I wonder if anyone's ever run into an issue, you know, because that investment, that long-term investment also assumes a certain amount of institutional continuity on the part of the institution. You know, the community itself might have more continuity than we do. And I wonder if anyone's ever run into issues, you know, related to people leaving or vice versa.
I can say for sure that we have at Florida International University. So I was giving Kelsey a little bit of background about myself, but I've been at my institution in a similar role since 2006. And so I have some institutional memory as far as the community partnerships that we've established over the years. And so we've had changes on both sides. There are community partners that we've worked with over the years where every single person that I got to know and develop a relationship with has moved on to other opportunities. And so, you know, I think that's a great point in you know, institutional memory and building relationships, because a lot of times it's individual. You're not building a relationship with an organization. You're building a relationship with individuals within an organization, at least from my perspective. So that is difficult. And one of the things we didn't note here, but is a challenge when you have many community partnerships that you're trying to sustain, that this is, you know, I think that in an academic organization, community partnerships are formed in many different ways. Some of the ways are communities approaching, for instance, like our department or center, and the other ways are faculty working directly with communities, and then that relationship then becomes part of your relationship with them. And so over the years, we've developed many community partnerships, and you know, working to sustain the relationships, but part of it, I tried to articulate, and actually I'm not sure if I put it down in a note, but to decouple the infrastructure and like the like you've built something together with this community partner from like your relationship with that partner, because sometimes that technical thing that's built is not sustainable, nor sometimes it's not desired to be sustained, right? Sometimes it's supposed to be ephemeral. And so I think I'm blabbing, but I think I've gone on a wild tangent. But I just think that part of the challenge is this, like, you know, balancing your relationships with individuals over a sustained period of time, especially when you have many community partners, and conveying the very real investment that takes to other people who are bringing additional relationships to your table.
Yeah, I'll just add to Jamie's point about building relationships with individuals. I've only been in my position since 2017, so not as long, but I've already seen that in my position. Like, I've built so many relationships, and like, I feel like the pandemic has increased like people's mobility, and more people are moving on, and like, I feel like I'm having to start at square one when I've like developed this relationship over the last 5 years with certain people, and now I have to start over with a different person and, like, you know, establish trust and like understanding of their expectations and our expectations. As Jamie was saying, like in Florida, like our DPLA hub is, you know, it's partly about sharing content and metadata to DPLA, but it's also about building those relationships to help build capacity, right? So it's not just about that one thing. It's about, you know, we have many individuals we consider partners that are not content contributors because they contribute other things, like time and expertise in other areas that are really valuable to building that network and building that capacity. So it's not always about that technical end product. It's about like other things that benefit the community and the community of practice.
Yeah, it's a great point. Are there other comments people want to weigh in on? You know, ideas about what our strengths and weaknesses, or just building on what we just talked about? We've got what, about 2 minutes left, Emily? Is that right? Yeah.
I'll just say, I think this has been just really, really wonderful. One of the things that I feel like is sort of threading through a lot of this is the tension between sort of individual relationships and actions and institutional ones, that I can have a relationship with someone, but that is very different than my institution having a relationship with them or with their institution. And sort of finding ways to negotiate that is, I think, something that takes a lot of care and a lot of intention, and I find very challenging, frankly.
I think that's exactly right. You know, it strikes me that maybe we haven't framed it that way, you know, and that we privilege institutional relationships over individual relationships. And I'm just riffing here at this point. So, you know, please disagree if you don't think that's true. But there might be, you know, that might be part of it, and how to respect those individual relationships more, and even find ways to continue them even after the individuals leave. I think that might be, I've seen that happen here, but not without an official framework. Like, it just is how some certain things happened. But I think if that was an intentional sort of policy or something that, was part of our job description somehow, we respected those individual relationships, I think, a little bit more. I think, to me, now I'm the one who's like blah blah blah. But I agree, Elliot. I was kind of hearing that too. So
I find it super interesting that most of our discussion has, I mean, I know it's a limited amount of time, but that we're kind of centered on this investment thing, because it makes me think that all of the other principles, maybe not all, I haven't thought all the way through this thought, but many of them rest upon this like foundation of being invested, like having this commitment to stay invested over time.
I think that's a really good point. And like the need for, I totally agree with Anne that like we need to give more credit or more value to the individual relationships, but without the institutional relationship and commitment, then this sustained commitment over time is just really not possible. And I don't know how to resolve that either.
Next workshop, right?
That's we meet every week.
I think this is a topic that I think has come up in different ways in the DPLA network, but not directly this of like how, and I think it was Jamie asked a question earlier, or maybe it was Kayla, I don't know, but like kind of how do you start that conversation in the first place with a community organization, and then how do you sustain these? Like, this is something I don't see a work group or a kind of thread at DPLA that in the DPLA network that where this is really being addressed, or maybe it is and I'm not aware of it, but this is something that
like a community engagement working group.
Yeah,
that's
an
interesting
idea to bring this to the DPLA network somehow.
Yeah, good idea.
I put it on the jam board, so we'll see.
So that means it's a stone now.
It's inscribed, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is probably a good spot to wrap up. I think Kayla has evaluation bit, but other than that, I know we'll have the recording to share and other things to share following today. So looks like there's a poll, and I think you're free to leave after you take the poll. Kayla, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, just thank you. This was again a wonderful workshop, and I appreciate the discussion.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody for sticking around. Okay. Well, happy weekend. Not the weekend yet, right?
To you. Take care.
Bye. All right.